Well, we're here again at the Leighton Buzzard narrow gauge railway. It just so happens that John Travolta was making a film a few days ago nearby, and he paid a visit with his son and took him on the train. How about that? It's a shame I wasn't making this film when he was here. Maybe he could have played a starring role in it. Anyway, in this video I'm going to be talking about the camera settings I use for portraits. Now, when taking photos of people, many factors come into play. So, although this film is primarily about the camera settings that I use and which I think are best, I'll also be talking about other aspects of portraiture. It almost goes without saying that the light is probably the most important factor in portraiture, along with the background and, your subject's expression. So I will touch on those subjects a little bit, but really I want to concentrate on the camera and the lens settings. My own personal preference for portraits is to get that great subject isolation by blurring the background. If you get it right, it can really make the subject pop out of the image and focus the viewer's eye on the subject. On the other hand, you might be on holiday, say, and want to show your subject near a famous background. So in that case, you don't want the background to be a blur of patterned colours. You want it to be recognisable as a famous building or landmark. In this film, though, I'm going to ignore that type of scene in favour of standard type portraiture. If you've watched my other films, you'll know that to blur the background, you do need a large aperture. That is a small f number. So to start off with, I'm going to set the camera to aperture priority, f2.8 on the lens. If your lens doesn't have such a wide aperture, just use the largest one you have. That is the small, the widest aperture. If I'm taking photos of a couple and I was quite close up, I wouldn't use such a large aperture. I'd switch to about f4 to make sure both of them were in focus. For 3 or more people, I'd close down the aperture even further to f5.6 or f8, depending on how many people in the photo. For a really big group, such as all the guests at a wedding, I'd use f11 and focus about a third or halfway into the group. Today I'm using an 85mm f1.8 Nikon lens, great for portraiture as it allows me to stand further back and still get in a fairly close-up shot. By using a longer focal length and standing further back for portraits, the perspective will be better and I'll get more flattering photos. I've said it before and I'll say it again, we all want to look good in our photos, so you should avoid getting in too close, especially for those head and shoulders type shots, as the face can become distorted. I'm going to be taking some portraits of Sophie here. We're already in some lovely light because it's a cloudy, overcast day and we've got these branches covering us, and so that will give us some top shade. When it comes to the light, I much prefer to use natural light with open shade or top shade, but if I'm just out in the open and I don't have anything covering, subtracting the light from above, I'll tend to use a reflector, and if I don't have a reflector, I'll use fill flash. So that's my preferences: top shade and then a reflector and then fill flash. So what about the metering mode? Well, usually I'm in evaluative or matrix metering mode. That's what I tend to use most of the time. But in this case, I think I'll go to spot metering, because I talked about spot metering on another film, and we'll give that a try to see if it works. Actually, I've just had a thought. Instead of using my fast 85mm lens, to start off with, I'm going to use this 18-200 Nikon lens, and this is a variable aperture lens, similar to lenses that come with most cameras these days. I'm going to set it to 35mm focal length, and the aperture it's given me is f4.2. So I'll take a shot with this lens and then we'll compare it to the one with the 85mm. I'm having to get in a bit closer now because of the focal length. That looks reasonable, but I think we'll see a big difference when compared to the next shot. I've now switched to the 85mm lens, which is a prime lens obviously, and I've set the aperture to f2.8. Now, when shooting at these very wide apertures, you have to be very careful about focusing. Now, normally I use the focus and recompose method, but when you're taking portraits this close and at such wide apertures, I find personally it's best to use one of the off-center focus points and focus on the eyes. That's the most important thing, because when you look at a portrait, the first thing you notice is a person's eyes, so it's best to get the eyes in focus. Let's give this a try then. I may have to move out of the shot as I don't want to be too close. Actually, no, it's fine about here. Little smile, Sophie, lovely. Look past me now. Yeah, this is a much better portrait. The blurred background really helps to isolate Sophie from the background, and as a viewer your eyes are drawn in towards her more. Also, if we compare the photos side by side, her face looks slightly slimmer, partly because I'm standing further back and so have a different perspective, but also because she's turned her face slightly away from me. But look at her upper arm, that also looks slimmer, doesn't it? Oh, and here's the shot where I asked Sophie to look away from the camera. She is looking rather pensive, but a lovely photo nonetheless. I'll now try something slightly different in the way of posing. We've still got some nice light with the overhanging branches, but this time it's going to be a full-length shot. Sophie's sitting against a tree, nice relaxed pose. Notice how she's got one leg up on the grass, the other one's slightly further down. Always makes a nice kind of pose. Let's give this a try. I have to come quite a long way back because it's a full-length shot. Come back even further. Okay, it's looking good. The hair's blowing around a little bit in the wind. Mine does that occasionally as well. Now look past me, Sophie. And now look down at the grass. These turned out pretty well. I like sideways seated poses, and I also like it sometimes if the subject doesn't actually look at the camera. Notice both the blurred foreground and background given to us by an aperture of f2. You can actually see the depth of field running through the image. By the way, I like sometimes to get out of focus highlights in the background, which you can see here between the trees. I want to make use of this grassy slope here, and I put Sophie lower down and I'll take a photo from higher up. And it's going to be a very close-up shot. Now I've set the aperture to its maximum of f1.8, and that's going to give me a very shallow depth of field, so I certainly won't be using focus and recompose. I'll just use one of the outside focus areas. The other problem is sometimes at these very shallow depth of fields you get one eye in focus and one eye slightly blurred, so what you want to do is focus on the nearest eye. Just change my focus point. This gives us a lovely portrait. You probably can't see it on your screen, but her hair on the far shoulder has gone very soft, as has the actual shoulder itself, and that's because of the shallow depth of field. By the way, I do prefer landscape orientation images with lots of negative space. There'll be a film about negative space one day on my other course. But here's what the image looks like in a portrait orientation. I leave it to you to decide which you prefer. Notice, by the way, that I've cropped off part of her head to give that shot a little more impact. Now when you do that, be bold. Don't just chop off the top of the head, really go for it. So far I've been using some clean, fairly uncluttered backgrounds, but in this shot I'm going to use that far wall with this brickwork, and because I'm using a wide aperture, it should make a kind of patterned background. Now we don't have the benefit of top shade, and in fact I think I'll take 3 shots, a straight photo, then one using reflector, and then I'll put the flash on the camera and use some fill flash. Now this reflector, by the way, is a kind of a semi-silver and a semi-gold, and I use these generally on a cloudy day. When the sun comes out, they're too bright. You blind your subject. So I normally use a white reflector for that. In fact, the sun is going in and out, so we have to be quick. But let's start off with a straight shot. Hair looks nice in the wind, bit of light on the back, beautiful. There's a few elements that make this a lovely photo. First, the wide aperture has thrown the brickwork completely out of focus so that we can't help but to look at Sophie's face. Secondly, most of the light is behind her, giving us some nice rim lighting round her hair, which is blowing in the wind. And finally, she has a lovely natural expression. Now we'll try one with the reflector. This is going to be more of a close-up shot because I don't have an assistant. Hold it a bit harder. Does put a lovely light on the face, so I had to get in close. I probably should have used a 50mm lens instead of the 85 to try and keep the same perspective so that we could compare it more easily with the other 2 shots. But you can see that she has lovely light on her face with more colour in her eyes. I've now put the flash on and it's in the TTL BL mode, which is a specific Nikon mode. If you don't have that, then just use TTL. And I've got the power dialed down to minus 1.7 because we don't want it to look too kind of over flashed. Let's give this a try, see how it looks. The fill flash shot has turned out well. A lovely light on her face and catch lights in her eyes. Comparing the three photos together, zooming in on these two, they all look pretty good. I prefer the light though best in the reflector shot. It's kind of crisper and a lot more natural looking than the one with fill flash. Notice by the way that I tried to keep Sophie engaged during the shoot. She's not a model, just a friend, so she's not used to doing this, but I kept chatting to her throughout and that helped to keep her relaxed and to get some lovely nice expressions. So that gives you an idea about the settings I use for portraits. I tend to use mostly manual exposure mode, but with the help of the exposure meter dial inside the viewfinder, you know, or on top on the LCD panel, or on the back LCD. I took some of the shots earlier using spot metering with a little overexposure, but normally I just use the evaluative or matrix meter mode. If you're not that comfortable using manual exposure mode, I'd recommend aperture priority for portraits, so that you can easily choose wide lens apertures. Now obviously many of you won't have fast prime lenses, so just set your lens to the widest aperture for individual portraits, not forgetting to close down the aperture by a stop or two for groups, as I mentioned earlier. When taking more kind of environmental photos, with say a famous landmark in the background, just choose a smaller aperture. So that's about it. Hope you've enjoyed the film. See you in the next one.